You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today I have Dr. David Coyle here with me, and I asked him to come on the show because of a really popular line of questioning that I've been getting from the listeners. So this one's for all of you out there that have been concerned or interested in invasive species. So Dr. Coyle is an extension specialist at Clemson University and deals with forest health, particularly in the context of invasive species. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, David.
Thanks, Marcus. Good to talk to you.
Yeah. So, I just want to get right on into the issue, David. There have been quite a few people that have reached out to me over the past year or so since the podcast has been going that were really interested or concerned, or however you want to put that, depending on the context, I guess, about using fire and potentially inviting invaders in. And there's been some specific examples of a few species, I think, that people are worried about. But I was curious, in your experience, what species, maybe of plants or insects or whatever you want to go with, should we be worried about that problem? Like, if you're actually going to engage and start burning your forest, are there any species that we might be worried about?
Yeah, I think I get a lot of those same questions. I think from a broad scale, a 30,000 foot view, there's good news and bad news when it comes to prescribed fire and invasive species. And I'll start with the bad news. You're probably not going to kill anything with prescribed fire, at least not permanently. But I think prescribed fire does work pretty well as part of an integrated management plan. It's a step. It's a piece of the recipe. In general, and we can talk about some specific some species in a minute, but in general, fire is going to kill seedlings. It's going to kill some of the seeds maybe that are right on top of the surface. It's probably just going to top kill stems, now especially the woody ones. It might top kill some of the grasses and stuff too. But anything that's established is going to resprout. And in the context of the woody things, the privet, the calorie pear, a lot of those invasive trees, the lanthus and, mimosa, that type of thing, those are going to resprout. So it's not that, you can't run a fire through somewhere and expect to eliminate all the invasives. It just doesn't work that way. They're too strong, they're too hardy. And, those characteristics are what make invasive species successful. They're early,
make them invasive.
Exactly. Yeah. They're early colonizers after a disturbance, and a fire is a disturbance. So you're kind of giving them that opportunity. The other thing to think about, and this is especially true with things like grasses, Japanese stilgrass, for example, is there's a huge seed bank anytime you've got a patch of this stuff. And that seed bank just waits for an opening, which fire creates. So if you put fire on stiltgrass, you're going to kill that stuff that's there. And then the next batch of seeds is just going to grow up. So you'd have to keep going and going and going to actually eliminate that invasive.
Mm-hmm. When you say an integrated approach, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like using fire in tandem with another management practice? What you mean?
Yeah, sorry, I sure do. To me, some of the most effective integrated approaches are a combination of herbicide and fire. And, for instance, you can run a fire through, you'll kill some of these, smaller seedlings. And then you got the regrowth that comes on the woody stems. That regrowth is going to be completely fresh, green, and the perfect stuff to hit with herbicide. Right? You're going to have a perfect application. All that stuff is going to get sucked down, and then you'll kill the roots of that thing. Kogon grass is a good example. We were chatting about this earlier, but the way Kogon grass is if you walk through a solid patch of it, about half of the stuff standing up is actually just dead leaves just standing there. It's kind of the biology of it grows and those leaves are dead standing up. So if you just spray herbicide on there, which is one of the only ways really to kill Kogon grass, half of your product is going on dead vegetation, which is, you're wasting it. So one of the best things you can do, and it's tricky to burn Kogon grass because it burns so gosh darn hot, but if you can get a fire across it, you're going to eliminate all of the dead stuff. It's going to grow back as this nice green succulent carpet that is just perfect for any herbicide application, because whatever you put down, 100% of your product is going on to green stuff, and you're going to have a much better control on that patch at that point.
Okay. So you can basically use fire to prep the plant to accept the herbicide to be more effective on it.
Yeah, that's exactly how I look at it. And that goes for the grasses, the woody things. It's tough if you've got a 20-foot high wall of privet. It's tough to kill that stuff. But if you run a good fire through there, top kill it, and then you've got a bunch of, you'll have 2-3 feet of vigorous green growth underneath. Well, that's a lot easier to hit with, foliar herbicide.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So what about those people who don't have any issues? Are there things that, that like they don't currently have invasives, but they're interested in burning this, this hardwood or pine stand or whatever, or maybe a grassland? Are there species that they need to worry about colonizing? I know that's dependent on where you are probably, but just wanted you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to meet someone that doesn't have problems with invasives. That would be amazing for starters. But I know
where are you?
Where are you? Reach out to us. I don't think there's anything that is going to come in because you've used fire. Fire, especially in the Southeast, is just such a standard management practice, and we encourage it in pretty much all of our landscapes. So you're not going to get invasive species because you used fire. If you're one of those, if you're the golden child or golden landowner that doesn't have invasives, and if you do get them, it's going to be because, they were brought in with an animal or grew in from the neighbors or whatever. Fire doesn't typically bring in invasives, but it can open up things. So if there is a seed there or a seed bank there, they'll be more likely to sprout. I guess what I would say is if you're burning, don't not burn because you think you might get invasives. Because if your land is destined to get invasives, it's going to get them whether you burn or not.
Yeah. Well, interesting. You were talking about animals bringing them in or whatever. I know some of the listeners probably know because I mention it occasionally, and it's not quite done yet. But I do have a student, David Mason, who has been working on how fire affects seed dispersal and how that affects what plants come back after a fire. And he's caught 20,000 plus seeds probably at this point. And I'm not aware of us catching, and when we're saying catching seeds, I mean bird dispersed seeds specifically. I don't know that we've caught a single seed from an invasive plant species, which to me is kind of shocking. Yeah. I would have expected it to be prevalent, based on this idea that fire might actually promote some invasive species. There certainly are some around that landscape, but we're not catching any of them.
Yeah, being a non-bird person, it's pretty easy just to blame birds for stuff. But maybe I need to change my tune a little bit.
Yeah, well, it certainly has. That hasn't formerly been my area of specialty, but in general, I'm really interested in understanding how all these different factors affect plant community structure for a habitat standpoint. And, that's what I've always heard is that birds are dispersing a lion's share of these plants and they're probably affecting where they occur. And we have a really good data set to show that birds have a magnet effect, just like deer or turkeys or whatever else. They're really attracted to a recently burned area. So the idea popped into my head, wow, there a bunch of seeds might be landing there. It turns out so far we've been catching, I don't know if it's quite tenfold, but substantially more seeds in recently burned areas than areas that haven't been burned recently. And I just kind of expected there to be some invasives, particularly things like privet or whatever, that people commonly say are being spread around by birds, and we just didn't catch any. So
maybe you found those magical places where there aren't invasives. Is that possible?
Yeah. No, they're in the landscape. That's what it was just, to me, I expected to have some proportion be that, and it's just, that's not what we're catching.
So that's neat.
Yeah. So I guess that's good news. So another thing, I guess, that comes up commonly, and I don't really know how to handle it very well, but I know that, in terms of answering the questions, but I think that you would know much better, is, from a forest health standpoint, a lot of people that are burning, they're, at least the ones that contact me, their primary interest generally is for wildlife habitat improvement, and then their secondary interest is forest management. But there are plenty of landowners out there that are interested in growing timber first as an objective. So are there concerns, I'm thinking about pine in particular here, but are there concerns with burning in that context, like with inviting non-native beetles or other things that might affect the tree health?
Not really. For the pine growers, you've got the southern pine bark beetle guild, which is basically your southern pine beetle. You've got Ips bark beetles and then turpentine beetles. Ips and turpentine beetles come to any stressed tree. So if you run a fire through there and it gets too hot and you've got lots of char and you've got stress, well, then that's going to call in some of those Ips and turpentines. We see that all the time. When the fire gets too hot, you're going to get some of those secondary things. That said, you'll get secondary things after a lightning strike. You'll get it after a tornado or a hurricane. Any of those factors that stress trees going to bring in those types of beetles. Southern pine beetle is quite responsive to basal area. So, and they're also keen on tree stress a little bit too. So if you put a fire through there and, it's not getting too hot and you're just removing that competing vegetation, that actually reduces susceptibility of that stand to southern pine beetle and these other beetles. There might be a little uptick right when it happens. That tree is a little bit shocked because all of a sudden you've got all this sunlight coming in, you've got access to all this stuff. But a good prescribed fire only improves the health of that forest, and it's not going to bring in, aggressive bark beetles. You're probably only going to get them where you've got, trees that got a little bit hot. But if it's just a scattered tree in there that got a little overheated, you might not even lose that tree. Sometimes they can rebound fast enough to sort of take over. So from a southern pine perspective, prescribed fire, provided it's not a rager, it's going to be great.
So as long as you're not scorching the canopy or damaging the tree with fire, you shouldn't expect
that's
an increase. But you could even decrease.
Yep. And that's why I call it a properly applied prescribed fire. I know things go sideways sometimes, but now for other invasives, we don't have a lot of pine infesting invasives, but we do have laurel wilt and red bay ambrosia beetle and emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle in some spots. Those don't seem to care if there's been a fire through there or not. They're so high on the aggressive scale. They are going to find their host, whether it's healthy, whether it's stressed, and they're going to hit it. So it's not like that's going to do a whole lot, to promote or reduce susceptibility to those invasive species, those highly aggressive ones. They're just kind of going to do their thing either way.
Yeah. Okay. So along those same lines, it just popped into my head when I was doing research. At some point, I came across a paper, and the reason it came to my head is it was like the moth to the flame type of thing, where this, I can't recall where it was, but I want to say it was in Oregon. They had initiated a nighttime prescribed fire, and there was an invasive moth species, and they just noticed that they all flew into the flame and killed themselves, essentially. So it seemed to be a good control. And it's the only paper I've ever found like that. But I was just curious, in your experience, that you were talking about it in the context of promoting them through indirect means by affecting the tree vigor. But what about direct consequences? Are there instances where you might control some of these invasive insects like that just by killing them outright with the fire, or maybe changing their fine scale habitat characteristics?
First of all, that study is awesome, and I don't know about that, but oh my gosh, that's great. And they've got a couple really invasive moths up in New England. What is that? Not the buck moth. I forget what it is, but they've got one up there. And, their fire regimes are much different up there, but that's something I'll have to chat with some colleagues about. I suppose you could a prescribed fire could kill some of the individuals if you're talking about invasive species. And I mean, realistically, we've got red band ambrosia beetle, emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid. Those are the three main forest invasive species that are not plants that we have down here in the Southeast. We have Asian longhorn beetle, but we know, that's pretty restricted, and that's kind of a different animal as far as management. You can certainly kill some of these insects with that fire, but they're so common on the landscape that new ones are probably just going to move in. So it would provide a measure of some local control, I suppose, but it'd be a matter of time before they were back. And the same goes with, all the southern pine beetles. Sure, you're going to kill some of those individuals with a prescribed fire, but those are all, southern pine, ips, turpentine. They are so common on the landscape that they're, and if you look at the range maps or prediction maps, basically anywhere a pine tree grows, you can find these things. So, okay, you might wipe them out of this 500 acres or so, but if they're pretty much on every side surrounding, it's just a matter of time before they're going to fly in again.
So it really seems like it's about the health of the trees that are there and whether or not they can fend them off, at least with a lot of these species.
Yeah, with the insects, especially the pine ones, it's all about keeping that stand healthy and keeping those trees vigorous, because a vigorous tree is going to be able to fight off those and pitch those out. And those beetles, especially ips and turpentine, they only get attracted to trees when they emit those stress chemicals, the ethanol, that type of thing. That's what, and some of the blanking on the term, but the smell of terpenes, the terpenes that come out. So those are the things that attract those beetles. And those things come from trees that are stressed. So if your trees aren't stressed, they're not even going to send those chemicals out. So it is very much just a good forest management practice to burn those things when they need to, because that'll reduce competition and, feed into everything else.
Okay. So I guess for some reason, it's making me want to go back to the integrated management, and I can't help but just think about plants when I think about that. But I could see in some context where you could use the herbicide or you were talking about using fire to remove dead vegetation, so you have a vigorous plant resprouting. Are there instances or some species that you might want to kill so that then they're flammable? I'm thinking about like some non-native pasture grasses, for instance, that you may actually go in and kill it and then burn it off to try to stimulate native things to recolonize.
Yeah.
Do you run into that?
We run into it occasionally, but that's a really good tactic, and probably works pretty well out west for some of the species they have out there. At the end of the day, any of this invasive plant management comes down to getting rid of the dead stuff, promoting either that invasive plant regrowth so it can be treated, or promoting the native stuff to retake over that place. And I think for each species, it's going to be a little bit different as far as which tactic you use and which order that you do things. Another thing that sometimes we do is fire and then run a disc over it and try to chop up that root mass. We do that with kogan grass sometimes. It's one of your options for smaller chunks, is try to break up that root mass. And I think whenever you're managing these invasive plants, you got to brace for a multi-year endeavor. The odds of a one and done are pretty slim. I mean, it can happen for smaller patches. It can happen for some of the trees or shrubs where you go in there and you do, direct like hack and squirt or basil bark where you're killing that individual all the way into the roots. But, a lot of times that's just not that simple. And fire is a really great tool because it's going to take care of killing the stuff that's there, or at least the top of it, but also promoting, growth of all the other good stuff too. You go in there and you hack and score something, and all you've done is killed that one tree. You've not done anything with the nutrient cycling and the other fuels reduction and all that type of thing. So I'm a pretty big proponent in using fire as part of a bigger, grander plan.
Sure. Well, that brought to mind another project that I'm sort of familiar with Craig Harper, the extension specialist at the University of Tennessee, extension wildlife specialist. He was working on old field renovation, I think, from converting fescue back. And as far as I recall, I think that was the approach. It was a couple of years where they were spraying to kill the fescue and then just using fire after they killed the fescue to promote native things. And I think it was even as effective as planting native stuff back in there as well. Like just using fire, there was enough native stuff in the community that they were getting a really great response, even though the fields had been in fescue for quite a long time. So is there anything like that integrated approach with the insects? I know there is from an agricultural standpoint, but are there any ways that you might use an integrated plan with fire to affect invasive insects?
I wish there was, but there really isn't. Just again, because those invasive insects are so aggressive that it doesn't seem to matter. And, the best thing you can do is if you've got a stand that's at the front of some of those invasive insects, the best thing you can do is just try to keep that overall stand as healthy as possible. And that usually means burning at some interval, depending on where you are and what type of stand you're looking at. I can't think of a time in which a prescribed fire is not a good idea. I mean, in every type of forested habitat, there are benefits to prescribed fires if you do it on the right interval and at the right time and that type of thing. So I see no downside to it. The bigger limitation usually is just being able to get a fire through some of those places, especially a lot of the hardwood stands, the bottom layer ones, and getting the right conditions, it can be really tricky nowadays to be able to you can put a fire in just because of the right conditions and wind speed and all that stuff. So that's almost the bigger limitation at this point, is having the ability to put that fire where it probably ought to be. Yeah.
But you made me think of another way to look at this that we haven't been considering is, I can preface this. I had a student that was looking at habitat for deer and turkey and how it responded to fire and thinning and a bunch of other things. And one of the things that he got interested in was non-native plants, responding to the different treatments. And we have since published a paper on it, but essentially we were finding less non-native plants, or at least lower dominance or lower proportion of the community were invasives in the more aggressive thinning and burning treatments. And when we were trying to figure out what was going on, the best explanation was the native plant community abundance and diversity. So the more we use practices like that, the more abundant and diverse the native community was, and that seemed to be fending off the non-natives, which is really common hypothesis, I guess, the biotic resistance hypothesis in your realm. But so that got me thinking. Now that I've prefaced it, what you just said got me thinking. Are there instances where stopping the use of fire might promote invasion?
Yeah, there is. One of the, I guess, a classic example is Chinese Teletree down there in the coastal plain. That thing, it's tricky because it's promoted both by fire and without fire. and it just is so aggressive taking over those little areas. Now, and this is coastal areas, it might be hardwood areas, it might be pine areas. Tallow doesn't really seem to care. Fire, and Jeff Wong up here at Clemson has done a bunch of work on that stuff, and Lauren Pyle, who's his former student over at Forest Service now, they've done a lot. And so what we know at this point, there used to be this thought that prescribed fire enhances tallow colonization. So that was a long-standing thought. But as we look more, we now know that fire will kill some of those seedlings. Tallow has a huge seed bank. I mean, that thing produces thousands. Every tree produces thousands of seeds. So you're going to get, resprouting. But if you keep a fire through there, you're going to kill seedlings. You're going to eventually wear that seed bank down. And he's got some data that shows that, the tallow tree itself is a sort of a live fast, die young type of deal. It's going to grow like gangbusters for 10, 15 years. And then a lot of them start to peter out at that point. So if you can get, your oaks in there, your pine, if you can get that stuff to just basically hang on and outlast it by the end of, by rotation, mid-rotation, end of rotation, you're going to have a pretty clean stand if you can just keep the seedlings at bay of the tallow tree, and then again, you're going to get some top kill and some resprouts, but, sure. Fire now is looked at as, it's a good thing for tallow. Yes, it's going to encourage some of those seed bank to come up, but it sort of collectively weakens some of those bigger trunks because it's pretty thin barked and everything. So we've sort of changed our tune on that one, and that fire really is good, especially when you get in there at the right, pretty rapid intervals if you got enough fuel and everything. So it's very species specific. We're doing a lot of work now with calorie pear, which you don't have a whole lot of in Florida, but you get up into the middle of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, up in the Carolinas, it is everywhere. It is rapidly becoming our number one issue here. Same thing. It'll top kill those things, and we've got some data that shows that for every top killed stem, you're going to get between 2 and 12 resprouts coming off that sucker. But those resprouts are lush green foliage that's just begging for some herbicide, So following that thing up, and that's kind of what we're working on now, is figuring out what is our integrated plan. What order should we burn and treat, and is it better to burn in the spring or the winter or the late fall? Trying to figure out some of those things. We know that it resprouts vigorously. I mean, everyone knows that thing resprouts, but it resprouts really, really susceptible to any herbicide. So putting those things together, I think, is going to be key moving forward. Yeah,
that's really cool. So when you brought up tallow tree, it made me think about it because I believe it's one of them that fits the bill, but I know there are several that fit this bill where the invasion of this particular invasive species alters the flammability of the system. So I think tallow, and you can correct me, I believe tallow is one that suppresses flammability.
Yep, you're right.
So, and then there are plenty of species also that enhance flammability, like you mentioned, Kogon grass burns so hot. And then like cheatgrass, I guess, or some of these invasive grasses do that across the United States where they enhance flammability. But just curious if you could talk about, issues that you might run into with that.
And that generally comes down to the physical structure of the leaves that drop, right? So grasses in general are going to be thin, and a lot of them will stand upright when they die, and then when they fall, think of it like a bunch of toothpicks falling on each other. There's lots of air between there, and so it's pretty easy for fire to have the oxygen to burn through there, and it's going to kind of increase that flammability. Tallow, like other hardwoods, those leaves are big and flat, so when they fall flat, it's like pieces of paper stacking on each other. And then, of course, those hold moisture, right? And the other thing with the grass and stuff, they dry out so quick. They tend to hold moisture. So you've got this flat stack of wet leaves that, if you've tried to start a fire using pieces of paper that are not crumpled up or, junk mail or something, it doesn't burn well because you're not getting enough air in there. So that's kind of what happens in general. And this type of discussion always reminds me of the Gatlinburg Fire a few years ago up in Tennessee, right? That big, really devastating one where the fire was out of control and it hadn't been, that area, that forest hadn't burned in a long time, partially because it was just tough to burn, but it was a lot of hardwoods there. But what happened in that particular case, and this is getting, I'm trying not to stray from the invasives, but it was so dry. We had that crazy drought that fall. So a lot of those hardwood leaves that normally were flat and wet and sticking together, they were drying out and curling up. And so you had a lot more airflow in there. You had a lot of high wind. And then once that ignition started, it was like the perfect storm. And that thing just took off because there was so much fuel on that ground. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the type of plant living and the type of leaf that falls structure-wise has a really big influence on how easy it is for fire to travel through somewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I know I've found a few papers when looking around in the literature where that was brought up. I think it was in a little different context. But what you reminded me when you were talking about the Gatlinburg Fire. I think it was with grass, some of these invasive grasses in particular, but the invasion of these really flammable species that are really strongly fire adapted and can kind of take over areas that were even promoting increasing levels of and intensity of wildfires, which is pretty incredible. There was one big paper recently that kind of put all that information together and just showed that was really common across the U.S. That invasions could really lead to some of these really problematic large fires.
Yeah, I'm sure, at some point fires are going to burn hot enough to where they're just going to kill everything. You're seeing that out west a lot with some of those things. I mean, that's like your full ecological reset. And hopefully nobody has a prescribed fire that goes that way, because that's not the point of that. But, this is just not to say that every fire will promote stuff. Not every fire will promote that rapid regrowth, because some of those really intense fires don't do that. They're just so harsh, it takes a while for stuff to come back. And that's probably when you will get those natives coming back that are more adapted to those longer and more intense burn cycles.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like when folks are going back to reevaluate their prescribed fire and that success, and I know I love to walk around right after things are starting to green up and starting to sparkle and see the forbs coming in and all the things that I want to see that turkeys and deer eat. They might ought to bring a backpack sprayer with them and spray some of these re-sprouting calorie pairs or whatever they have in that system.
It's a great time to do it, and it's, give it a month or two and let stuff get 12, 18, 24 inches tall. It's the perfect time to knock that stuff out. And, we were doing some work up here in Georgia this summer, right after a burn, about that time, about a month and a half after. And all the calories were 12, 18 inches tall. It was the perfect time to spray those things with, glyphosate, tricopyr, any of that stuff works when it's that sort of vulnerable. And get your steps in, walk around, do some spraying, and you'll have a really good success getting rid of some of those invasives. Yeah,
that's a good idea. Plus, it's a really good place to find shed antlers. So you can make a day of it to do several things at the same time. Your
teenage kid has to learn how to do that stuff at some point. Give them a backpack sprayer for Christmas and send them on their way, man.
Oh, a Christmas present.
That's right. I don't think that's the worst.
What is this thing?
So let me show you.
yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I'm going to have to keep that in mind when my daughter gets old enough. I'll give her a backpack sprayer for her birthday or something.
But it's fire should never not be used, in my opinion. I think the benefits to fire far outweigh anything that's going to regrow from it. Invasives are tricky. They're going to come back. That's why they're invasive. Like if they weren't hardy and able to deal with stuff like this, they wouldn't be an invasive here anyway. So, just as long as people have an understanding of what they're dealing with and realizing that fire is super appropriate for certain life stages of that plant. It can do some things, not all things, but it can do some things, and it can set you up for success in some of these other areas. It's just a matter of using it at the right time. So we still don't, there's a lot of questions about when fire is the most effective for these invasives. Is it a growing season burn, dormant season burn? Those are some of the nuanced questions that we just don't know yet, and people are working on it. So, and that's one of those things where it really is a species by species deal. You can't just say, well, if it works in the winter for privet, it'll work for everything else. So that's not really how life is. So it just takes time to figure this stuff out. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad people are working on it. I've been involved in a little small share of it myself, but I think you're exactly right. The nuances species by species might change, but something like privet, you may have a hard time burning that at any other time than the winter. Whereas I was on one student's committee, and we're working on trying to get the information out now where it was in grassland context, and the summer burns actually were much more effective at decreasing the prevalence of invasive grasses in that system. So yeah, definitely, there's a lot to learn about this, but I guess before we kind of close down, we've named quite a few species, and I guess I am putting you on the spot. Are there some species that are really common in the South that people could be thinking about using fire, when they're using prescribed fire, thinking about that as an opportunity to get rid of those plants? So, which species are those? And then I guess it would be generally a follow-up herbicide application that they'd be using.
Yeah, I think, in the Southeast, some of these invasives we have, you've got to be careful. Something like Japanese climbing fern, you got to make sure you're not using that thing. That thing will become a fire ladder pretty quick if you're not careful when you burn that, because it grows up the trees and the dead vines just kind of stay up there. So keeping all of that in mind, the main invasive plants we see in the Southeast: Kogon grass, climbing fern, privet, honeysuckle, depending on where you are. A lot of the invasive trees, calorie pear is one of the worst. But we're also seeing, ailanthus, and that's a really big kind of point of emphasis up here in the Carolinas now, since that's one of the main hosts for the spotted lanternfly, which is another invasive bug that we only have, it's in Virginia so far, but it's pretty devastating up in the Northeast and I guess mid-Atlantic where it is. So people are working a little more to get rid of ailanthus. It's unfortunate that there's so many. The list could go on and on as far as what are the main plants, but all of them are susceptible to some degree to fire. Whether it's the seedlings, whether it's the new growth, whether it's some of the seed bank, all of them are susceptible. So it just comes down to using that fire as part of a plan and sort of understanding that you can't just burn it and walk away. Burning it and walking away for 2 to 3 years you're gonna come back to even more invasives when you get back there.
Do you think that's kind of driving that perception? Is it that we're using prescribed fire and not following up on that could actually lead to a successful invasion, whereas it could have been, if we had followed up on it, it could have been that opportunity to nip it in the bud?
Yeah, I think so. I think to really get rid of invasives takes a really big pulse of effort and resources, right? You're talking, money and effort and everything. But if you don't do that, you're just spinning on this hamster wheel of, okay, I top killed it all. I came back in 2 years. It was covered in invasive plant again. Top killed it all. Come back in 2 years, covered in invasive plant again. Well, of course it is. All you're doing is top killing it. If people really want to make, if they really want to make some progress, you've got to do a 1-2 punch type of deal and burn it, herbicide it, or herbicide it, burn it. You probably won't get rid of all of it, or you're going to get rid of a heck of a lot more than if you just burned it. Right. And, and that's just the fact. I do think a lot of people don't follow up for whatever reason. A lot of people don't follow up how or when they should. And then you get this sort of mantra or thought that, well, burning just makes invasives worse. And a lot of times it does if you don't do anything, right? Because you're just opening up space to the early colonizer, the aggressive colonizer to come in there. So it's got to be a 1-2 punch, But again, it's a super tool. You just got to use it the right way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I know I'm working with a few landowners right now that they're frustrated, for lack of a better term, particularly the ones that, Japanese steel grass and Kogon grass are the ones that I get all the time. They're frustrated about dealing with those, but it sounds like you can use fire to your advantage in those cases to make them vulnerable, like you've said throughout the podcast. So it's really good ideas and useful for people to think about.
And we're trying to encourage that more too, as we, of course, as we learn more, we're starting to figure some of this stuff out. And we know that a lot of these things are just going to get top killed, but it sets it up really well for a follow-up herbicide application. And that can happen. You can make a lot of progress in 1 year, getting a dormant season or a late spring burn, and then that thing, resprouts, and then middle of summer.
Yeah, and it's easier to walk around in the stand, and it's a nice time of the year right there in the early spring. There happens to be turkeys gobbling at that time of the year. It's nice to hear those. Maybe we could put it in the backpack sprayer in the pouch back in the
That's right.
in the back when we're.
That's right.
Don't put it past me. I do things like that all the time.
Yeah, and I think the one one other thing is, I want landowners to think about, and managers to think about, how much money might be spent with repeated burns every 3 years versus how much you're going to spend a certain amount over time. It's not going to be that much in 1 year, but that's going to add up. Versus if you just dump some money into it in like 1 calendar year with a boom, 1-2 punch, I would wager a lot that you're going to save money over the long term. It's an investment is all you're doing. You got to invest in getting rid of some of those detrimental flora in there.
Sure. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And the other way to look at it as well is if you don't, you could basically just burn over and over and over. And if you'd have nothing but non-natives respond over and over, then that was just wasted.
Yep.
That effort was wasted. So it makes a lot of sense to think about that as an opportunity to have that power punch, as you said. So, well, are there any other things that that you think people should know or be thinking about related to prescribed fire and invasives?
I just think fully support the use of prescribed fire. I would love to hear if people have instances where it did or didn't work. I think that's some of the things that we're kind of lacking as extension specialists. Speaking for myself, I'd love to hear examples of where someone burned and this particular invasive came back like gangbusters, or this one didn't as much. Those types of anecdotes help drive the research we do. I'm sure same for you. I think just knowing what people are seeing and where it would help to know more will help us figure out what we can be doing to help, everybody else a lot better.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. A lot of the things that I do from a research standpoint and a communication standpoint, just like inviting you here today, come from that kind of feedback from people that are struggling with something or need information on something. And that definitely drives it. So, everybody out there listening, if you have, some good anecdotes about using fire and it promoting or you had a successful eradication, any of those kinds of examples, forward them along to us. So we love to see that stuff, and it's really helpful for us to help you. So with that being said, I always like to close it down with, letting people know where they can find you easily. So if they want to find you or contact you, how can they do that?
If they are so inclined, I'm happy to be emailed, dcoyle@clemson.edu. That's DCOYLE. I am on Twitter, Instagram at Dr. Dave Coyle, DRDAVECOYLE. Recently joined TikTok. I'm still not sure if I'm any good at it yet, but I've got some stuff on there. Same handle, Dr. Dave Coyle. And again, you just Google Clemson Extension Dave Coyle and stuff will pop up right away. So I'm out there on the interwebs.
Well, now, yeah, I don't feel so ahead of the times, I guess, because the Deer Lab has been curating the TikTok thing. I don't think anybody knows that yet because we hadn't really gone public with it, but it's nice to know that there are others dipping their toe in that water.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying. It's one of those things where I don't know. It's
hard for us to understand, but you're a little bit too old for it.
My 8-year-old was sitting there last night as I was trying to upload a video of an invasive spider up in these parts, and so he was trying to guide me on what music to use and all that type of thing. So it's like, man, you gotta go to bed. You're old. Get out of here.
That's hilarious. Your 8-year-old's showing you.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at. So don't, if you go to TikTok, prepare to be underwhelmed.
Yeah. Well, it's just like everything else, it's a daunting task, but you just got to go after it. Just like these invasive species, we're doing that with TikTok.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's good stuff. Well, it was a real pleasure talking to you. I'm very thankful that you had time to come on and talk to us about this. I think a lot of people are really interested in this topic, and there's a lot of great information. So thanks. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate you having me on, Marcus. I always enjoy chatting.
Yeah, it's really fun. So we'll have to do it again sometime soon.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. And just as a reminder, please do send us anecdotes if you have them on your successes or failures using fire to control or promote invasive species. We really appreciate it.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.